Thank you, Marilee.
Thanks, Jenna.
Hi, everybody. I'm so glad to be here with everyone today. And as Marilee mentioned, I'm going to be talking with you about risk factors and protective factors. Okay, you can see the image on the screen here of a rock climber. Why do you think that might be the image that we use to describe risk factors?
Well, it could be very dangerous, and obviously he's attempting something.
Yes, exactly. That's right. It's very dangerous. I don't know if anyone in here rock climbs. I don't. However, if I did, I would certainly want all of the tools that this man has so that he can navigate through the difficult journey ahead. So we talk about risk factors as being stressful events, situations, or conditions in a person's life that may increase the likelihood of them attempting suicide or dying by suicide. And that's the definition of risk factors. You may be able to think of a few risk factors with people that you have known or people that you work with. If you work in schools or mental health, a lot of people may start coming to mind as we go through some of these risk factors. So we're going to start talking about biological and psychological. If you take a look at this list, again, is there anybody who can think of somebody who they know who has had these biological or psychological risk factors? Let's see the show of hands, people. This is looking familiar. Great. Okay, so of course, mental illness and substance abuse, as Marilee talked about earlier, 90% of the people who die by suicide have an underlying mental health or substance abuse issue. This may be undertreated or undiagnosed, which is another important point to mention about this. We may not know that they're suffering in this way, right? So these are the risk factors: hopelessness, aggressiveness, trauma, bullying. We're hearing a lot in research and a lot in the media about this right now. So I know that that's something we're all aware of. What you may not have noticed or honed in on before that research is telling us is the pre-existing vulnerabilities that come with feeling different than your peers, maybe obesity, or feeling just a general awkwardness, right? Some people are just awkward in their bodies, or they're just awkward in social situations, and those things can be risk factors, and those are things we need to be able to cue into when we're working with folks. We have GLBTQ, that's gay, lesbian, bisexual, transgender, or questioning. So we see that a lot in the media also. That does get a lot of attention, but they are people that are in a higher risk group. And you'll see at the very bottom of the slide, previous suicide attempt is being underlined. Why do you think that might be? Does anybody know? It's like what Marilee just talked about, that unfortunately each time that somebody takes an attempt, we have to take this seriously because this is the person, in fact, attempting to overcome their own biology and take their life. Okay. The other part of risk factors, mental and addictive disorders. So we know that we may have what we call co-occurring. These are the most powerful risk factors. So if we have a substance abuse issue and a mental health issue, then again, we know we really need to cue into those risk factors. Okay, another piece of risk factors is the social, cultural. And these might be things that you think of before. You may not think of this piece, though. Some of you that are volunteers or advocates in the field may be actively working on this idea of reducing stigma. That's actually part of our state plan for suicide prevention, is to reduce the stigma associated with seeking help and help-seeking behaviors. Okay? Anybody known somebody who just didn't want to seek help because the stigma, they didn't want to be labeled, right? They didn't want to be labeled as having a problem or being crazy, right? There's still a lot of stigma alive and well in Texas, unfortunately. And so that is a risk factor. Barriers to health and mental health care, not feeling like you can access help or know where to get help. And again, those are going to be some things that we cover later in the training. Cultural and religious beliefs that might normalize suicide. Again, we see that sometimes in the media or in the news. Unfortunately, there are certain cultures where this has been normalized, this type of behavior, and that is very sad. And we want to recognize that that does exist and go on. A risk factor, like we talked about before, maybe of being gay or maybe of being overweight, and these are things that make us self-conscious as people, but what that does further is that has people feeling isolated. And there's a lot of different things that keep people feeling separate from their community and separate from their peers, separate from friends or groups that they would like to belong to. And so you can see the factors there that play in. We've already talked about the stigma, of course. Okay. Then we have environmental risk factors. So when I usually do this training, one of the things that always comes up if I was to have everybody raise their hand would be everybody guessing about loss. And if you think about people that are vulnerable, loss is a very important thing to think about, and it could be loss of a relationship or moving, losing all friends and having to make new friends, but also certainly the death of somebody that we love or somebody close to us, or of a pet. You know, anything that's a protective factor for us. And then Marilee has already talked about easy access to lethal means. We know that that's a huge environmental risk factor. Let's say you have a youth, and like Marilee gave the example of working on the ranch, but there's a lot of access to guns there and people with guns easily accessible. We know that is going to be a higher risk factor, right, than somebody who does not have access to those. Or perhaps we have somebody who works in medical services or pharmaceutical services that have easy access to pills that they could use to overdose. So those are things that are going to make a higher risk factor. This last piece, exposure to clusters of suicide. We know that the CDC has a definition of clusters. And we look at that, and what that is that's when in time and in place there are more suicides that would normally be recorded in a particular area or series of time. And so that is called a cluster of suicide, and that is another thing that we need to be real careful of.